The morning felt like any other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I stood by the counter, stirring a spoonful of sugar into my cup. The hum of the fridge, the faint sizzle of bacon on the stove, the sound of my husband flipping through the morning news on his phone. It was all routine. Predictable. Safe. But something felt off. I couldn't place it at first, just a slight unease sitting at the edge of my thoughts. My phone buzzed on the table. A message. I glanced down, expecting a work reminder, maybe a grocery list update. Instead, my breath hitched. "Did you think about me?" The words glowed on the screen. No name. Just the message. But I knew who it was. I locked my phone instantly, pulse quickening. My husband, oblivious, kissed my cheek before heading to the door. "See you tonight," he said, his lips brushing my skin. It felt distant, like a habit rather than affection. I forced a smile, but my mind was already somewhere else. That night, after the house settled into silence, I unlocked my phone again. My fingers hovered over the screen. I read the message once. Then again. A slow, unfamiliar thrill crept through me. Had I thought about him? My heart pounded as I realized the answer. The restaurant was dimly lit, the low murmur of conversations blending with the clinking of glasses. I hadn't planned on being here, not really, but somehow the night had unfolded this way. A work event, a dinner, and then him. Sitting across from me, his presence impossibly familiar yet suddenly charged with something unspoken. His smile was effortless, his eyes sharp, observant. The conversation started as it always did, easy and light, touching on work, on family, on the mundane details of life. But then, somewhere between a sip of wine and a shared glance, it shifted. His words slowed, deliberate. Compliments, small but pointed, slipped between sentences like they belonged there. I laughed, not because I had to, but because something inside me stirred. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. By the time he offered to drive me home, I knew I should say no, but I didn't. The car was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine. When I reached for the door handle, his fingers brushed mine. He didn't move away. For just a second too long, neither did I. The entire day felt different. Conversations blurred, tasks at work became mechanical, and every free moment was filled with the weight of last night. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. I wasn't just a wife today, not just a mother. I felt awake. When he texted in the evening, offering a ride after my workout, I hesitated for only a second before saying yes. The car smelled like leather and cologne, the warmth of the heater making the space feel too intimate. We laughed about something trivial, but beneath it, the silence crackled. I knew it. He knew it. The air between us was tight, stretched, waiting. Outside my building, I reached for the door handle, but he leaned in just slightly, just enough. I should have pulled away. I didn't. His lips brushed mine, tentative then certain. It was fleeting, a whisper of something inevitable, but not nearly fleeting enough. My breath caught, and then I was inside, closing the door behind me. In the mirror, my reflection stared back, flushed, breathless. What had I just done? I threw myself into routine, forcing every movement to feel natural, every smile to seem effortless. I made breakfast without hesitation, kissed my husband's cheek like always, laughed at my daughter's complaints about school. I told myself nothing had changed, but inside everything burned. I replayed the kiss in stolen moments. His touch, the way my breath had caught, the way I hadn't pulled away. It was a mistake. It had to be. When my husband surprised me with dinner reservations, candles already flickering at a restaurant we hadn't visited in years, I knew he sensed something. His eyes searched mine, looking for what had shifted. I reached for his hand across the table, held it tightly, told myself this was right. This was safe. But even as I smiled, my mind wandered, my pulse betraying me at the memory of another hand, another touch. My phone stayed silent. No new messages. He wasn't reaching out, and I told myself that was good. But late that night, staring at my screen in the dark, I realized something that terrified me more than anything. I wanted him to. I needed to fix this. Whatever had shifted, whatever had crept between us, I had to push it away. That night, as my husband sat beside me on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, I turned to him, studying the familiar lines of his face. This was my life, my home, my reality. Without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him first. He stiffened for half a second, surprised, but then responded, his hand resting at my waist, his lips pressing back with warmth, with comfort. But that was all it was. Comfort. No rush of heat, no breath catching in my throat, no pulse racing in my ears. Just familiarity. I deepened the kiss, desperate to feel something, but the more I tried, the clearer it became. Something inside me was missing. Or maybe gone. I pulled away, forcing a smile, pretending nothing had changed even as my stomach twisted. Later that night, lying awake, my phone buzzed beside me. My breath caught. "If you want to talk, you know where to find me." My fingers trembled. I shouldn't answer. But my heart pounded at the thought that I could. I told myself it was just a conversation. Nothing more. A simple meeting in a public place, neutral, harmless. When I arrived at the cafe, he was already there, leaning back in his chair, watching me with that same unreadable expression. I sat across from him, but the table between us felt too small, the space too intimate. We talked, or at least pretended to. About work, about mutual friends, about things that didn't matter. But beneath every word was the weight of everything we weren't saying. His hand rested on the table, fingers close to mine. When he reached for his coffee, his knuckles brushed my skin. Light, unintentional, but deliberate all the same. I didn't pull away. My heartbeat drummed louder than our conversation, my breath shallower than it should have been. We both knew. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a choice. When we stood to leave, he reached for my wrist just for a second, his fingers barely closing around it. Warmth spread through me as I stepped away. Hours later, lying in bed, I could still feel it. A touch that shouldn't have meant everything but did. He noticed. Of course he did. At first it was subtle, longer pauses before answering his questions, a distant look when he spoke, the way I seemed present but not really there. "Everything okay?" he asked one evening, watching me across the dinner table. I forced a smile, nodded too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? He didn't look convinced. The questions came more often after that. Harmless at first, then sharper, more insistent. "You've been distracted lately." "Work's been crazy," I snapped, too defensive, too quick. He studied me, searching for something I wasn't ready to admit, and I hated how uneasy it made me. Meanwhile, things with him stayed careful. No reckless moves, no obvious signs. Just lingering glances, fingertips brushing as he passed, words laced with meaning but never spoken outright. It was perfect. Until the moment it wasn't. My phone buzzed late one night. A message. I reached for it instinctively, but when I looked up, my husband was watching. He saw the way I hesitated, the way I turned the screen away before unlocking it. His expression shifted. Silent. Calculating. And in that moment I knew I was running out of time. She had spent the afternoon baking, trying a new dough recipe for the first time. Everything seemed to be going well until it was time to put it in the oven. Her cat, always curious, jumped onto the counter at the worst possible moment, knocking over the large mixing bowl just as she was about to pour the batter into the tray. The mess was everywhere, and she sighed, realizing she'd have to start over. As she cleaned up, she accidentally brushed against the hot oven door. The brief contact sent a sharp sting through her skin, making her pull her hand back immediately. Frustrated but determined, she grabbed an oven mitt and carefully placed the new batch inside, hoping this time nothing would go wrong. That evening she met him in a quiet spot behind the cafe. No crowd, no distractions, just them. His eyes searched hers, his hand lifting to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, deliberate. She didn't stop him. He didn't want to. When his fingers traced her cheek, she closed her eyes. And then, "What's going on here?" The voice was low, controlled, but unmistakable. Her eyes snapped open. Her husband stood just feet away. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. But the look on his face said everything. The drive home was suffocating. No words, no music, just the sound of tires against the pavement and the heavy weight of his silence. She wanted to say something, anything, but every thought died before reaching her lips. When they walked inside, he finally spoke. "Why?" Just one word, steady, controlled, but carrying the weight of everything between them. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. How could she explain? How could she tell him it wasn't about love or betrayal or even him? That it was about feeling something again, about remembering who she was before life turned into routines and responsibilities. That for the first time in years she had felt seen. She swallowed hard, staring at the floor, knowing no answer would be enough. His jaw tensed. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to understand something that never would. Then without another word he grabbed his keys and walked out. The door shut behind him with a finality that sent a chill through her. The house felt cavernous, empty in a way she had never known. She was alone. And maybe for the first time she truly felt it. The house felt different without him. No footsteps in the hallway, no sound of the shower running in the morning, no keys dropping onto the counter when he walked through the door. He hadn't answered a single call. Not one message. He was gone and she didn't know if he was coming back. The silence was unbearable. Her daughter barely spoke, barely looked at her. When she finally did, her voice was quiet but sharp. "What did you do?" No anger, just raw disbelief. She wanted to explain, to make her understand, but how could she when she didn't fully understand it herself? Her daughter shook her head, walked away, and the distance between them had never felt so wide. And then there was him. The man who had made her feel alive, who had made her forget, who had pulled her into this storm. He was gone too. No texts. No calls. No trace that he had ever been there at all. By evening the house was dark, empty. She sat alone, staring at nothing, and for the first time she realized the truth. She had nowhere left to go.